from the Natchez, Mississippi area. Aunties, my grandparents, my great-grandparents all came up in the general vicinity, Lawman, Mississippi, Fayette, Mississippi, Natchez, Mississippi. I've even gone to grave sites, in Natchez, Mississippi. And in all that time and talking to all my relatives, I've never heard anyone ever mention before the Devil's Punch Bowl. So let me get into some detail about the Devil's Punch Bowl. And I want to thank one of my subscribers. I won't mention by name because I didn't get his permission. But he brought it to my attention around, can I give some insight on the Devil's Punch Bowl? And, I thought I would do some research on it and look it up. And then, share with you what I learned, and I'll give you some commentary as I go through the process, okay? Now, the Devil's Punch Bowl is a location. From what I understand, historically speaking, they claim it's about 450 million years old. It's about 300 feet deep, and it supposedly got its name because the landscape was such an odd, uncomfortable type of place where you really couldn't do a whole lot there, I suppose, that they didn't want to say it was God's country, using their words, so they named it, the Devil's Country, in essence, the Devil's Peach Bowl. But that's not what we're going to talk about here. What we're going to talk about is what happened around 1864 to 1866. The Union Army had already taken over, the Vicksburg, Mississippi area, all of the Natchez area. Matter of fact, it was President Grant, who had gone through, President Grant, at the time he was General Grant, who had gone through that area, and it pretty much had cut off the Union soldiers at that particular point. And quite frankly, after Grant and his army took over the Vicksburg area, which included that area down through the south of the Mississippi, it ended any ability for the Confederate soldiers to continue to subsist. It cut off their food, it cut off their water, cut off all their supplies. It got so bad for the Confederate soldiers that they were eating their own animals, and at some point were about to resort to cannibalism until ultimately they decided to surrender to Grant and his army. Now, that being the case, that the Union Army was there to liberate the slaves in that area. They were going through all of the South, and as they won victory by victory, wherever there were people of color, those people were liberated. If you've ever seen the movie Glory with Denzel Washington and Morgan Freeman, if you haven't, go look it up. It's an interesting story. It's about the 54th Massachusetts Black Regiment. They were Union soldiers, who fought. But that's not the story either. But that story will give you some insight on what they call, slave contraband. And what they would do when they would go to the different plantations, they would free a lot of the slaves. And in some instances, they would use them for labor, the ex-slaves. The Union Army would use the ex-slaves for labor. And I bring this up because there are many people saying that, because you'll understand, I'm not going to even get ahead of myself. But they would use, the formerly free slaves or the former slaves. The Union troops would use them for labor. They would be building homes, building bridges, redoing roads, whatever labor task that was necessary, they would use the former slaves, to do that, and even let them fight in little small scrimmages, and they were called contraband, soldiers, okay? But the Devil's Punch Bowl was when they went down into the Natchez area. At that time, the city of Natchez, when the Union troops came and liberated the slaves on those plantations in that area, I'm sure that include all of my grandparents and all of my ancestors who were around during that time. Well, Natchez was a city of about 10,000 people, mostly white, with slaves. But when the slaves were freed in the surrounding areas, overnight, Natchez, Mississippi went from 10,000 people to approximately 120,000 people. So if you do the math, that's about 110,000 slaves as they were as they were being liberated from the plantations. They all settled in the Natchez area as they continued to decide where they were going to be going next. Well, the white citizens of Natchez became so upset with having all those blacks overrunning their city that they worked out with the Union Army to build concentration camps. And what they did is they put the blacks, former slaves, inside of those concentration camps. You had the men on one side, you had the women on the other side, okay? And then they walled the camps off, and that's pretty much how the Devil Punch Bowl, in terms of the area, became so significant with the Civil War and the atrocities that were committed against the former slaves by, yes, the Union Army. There are some people saying, oh no, the Union Army would have never done anything like that. Well, if you knew anything about the reason why the Union Army were fighting, at least most of them were told they were fighting, was to preserve the Union. To preserve the Union. And then when the Conscription Act was passed by Lincoln around 1863, it forced whites up north to go fight. They didn't want to fight. They were forced to fight in the Civil War. The Union soldiers I'm talking about. Unless they had $300 where they could buy their way out, they had to go out down and they had to fight and they had to serve the Union. So this narrative around all of these Union soldiers who were so anti-slavery, so with an abolitionist mentality, that's old wise fables. That is not true. Most of the Union soldiers were just as racist and bigoted as the Southern soldiers. And had the war had been announced in the very beginning, talking about the so-called war between states, I can assure you this, the Union soldier would have said, hell no, they're not going anywhere to free any so-called niggers. Okay? That's just the facts. If you know anything about your history, you know that I know what I'm talking about. Okay? And I haven't given you, again, that fact check me. Just fact check me if you think what I'm saying is incorrect. Okay? That information is anywhere that you want to go and find it. If you really look, if you're willing to just do a little bit, I'm about to say, if you want to look hard, you don't even have to look hard for it. It is right there for you. Interestingly enough, this is not about movies, because I know I mentioned Glory already, but if you watch The Gangs of New York, with Leonardo DiCaprio and, what's this guy's name? I always forget his name. Daniel Day-Lewis. I think his name is Daniel Day-Lewis. There's a big part inside of the movie Gangs of New York, where there's a whole lot of negative energy in the 5 points of New York when Lincoln passes the Conscription Act, and a lot of the whites in New York started attacking, especially the Italians and the Irish, started attacking the black citizens in New York City because they were so angry and upset that they had to go fight for so-called liberation of niggers. Just using their word, okay? All right, but you can check that out if you choose. But let me just read a little bit about the story, okay? All right, it says, as slaves made their way to freedom, the town of Natchez went from a population of 10,000 to 120,000 people almost overnight. In order to deal with the population influx of recently freed slaves, a concentration camp was established to essentially eradicate the slaves. Okay? The men were recaptured by the Union troops and forced back into hard labor. By the Union troops and forced back into hard labor. All right? If you know about the prison industrial complex and places like Angola and Parsons, Mississippi, which is right outside of Natchez, I might add. Well, I think Parsons might be central Mississippi. But Parsons, Angola, those were former plantations that are now prisons. And they went right from plantations to prisons right after the end of the so-called Civil War. Well, not the so-called Civil War, right at the end of the Civil War. That's where your 13th Amendment came into play. And if you know anything about my prior videos, I told you about the 13th Amendment, how that it did not abolish slavery. It's just slavery by another name in terms of the mass prison industry, or the prison system as we know it today. All right. So the women and children were locked up behind the concrete walls of the camp and left to die. The men were recaptured by the Union and forced back into hard labor. The women and children were locked behind concrete walls of the camp and left to die from starvation. Many also died from the smallpox disease. In total, over 20,000 free slaves were killed in 1 year. 20,000 in 1 year inside of this American concentration camp. 20,000, guys. Think about that. Think about 20,000 people. You've been to a college football game, not a major college, but a mid-level college football game where you might have 15 to 20,000. That's a lot of people in 1 year. Okay? Were left to die and starve to death by the Union so-called liberating soldiers. Okay. A researcher studying the existence of the concentration camp said the Union Army did not allow them to remove the bodies from the camp. They just gave them shovels and said, bury them where they drop. The camp was called the Devil's Punch Bowl because of the way the area is shaped. The camp was located at the bottom of a cavernous pit with trees located and on bluffs above. Today, the bluffs are known as the Wild Peach Grove, but locals will not eat any of the fruit because some are aware of what fertilized the trees. Huh. I guess that's kind of eating fruit and candy, being a cannibal at the same damn time. One researcher has noted that skeletal remains still wash up when the area becomes flooded by the Mississippi River. Even when America tries to bury its racist ways, we must force America to acknowledge what has occurred and not shy away from the truth. Let's never forget all the free slaves that died in American concentration camps at the Devil's Punch Bowl. And there you have it. In general, and in summary, you had a situation where angry Union white soldiers, who were supposed to be there to liberate these black men and women and children, took it upon themselves to create a situation so horrific that it is said that many of the men who were enslaved were begging to go back to the plantation that they were free from, because their life, they were better off on a plantation than being freed by bigoted northern white supremacists. And see, history is, American history, guys, I'm telling you, is a lie well told. I'm gonna say it to you again. American history is a lie well told. If you really want your children, especially you with young children at home, guys, you've heard me talk about this before. You need to pull your kids out of public schools, private schools, anywhere they're teaching this lie of so-called the history of America. Because most of it is either told in reverse or just whitewashed and omitted all of these actual facts of what so-called Negroes, Hebrew Israelites is what they really are, or were and are, what they were put through by these vicious, evil men and women who did everything in their power to eliminate the race. And so when you hear these big, wonderful stories about all these abolitionists, and they love black people so much, and they wanted the best for black people, and all of these white men who signed up for the Union Army to go and liberate. Well, if you saw my video yesterday, you heard Lincoln talk about that. This was not about some guilty conscience, a moment of clarity where whites decided that, we've been wrong and we've done things. America still hasn't apologized for this. But this was not about, some guilty conscience where they wanted to go and write things for the people, for the farmer, or for those who were enslaved, or those who were formerly enslaved, as in with the Devil's Punch Bowl. No, it was all about preserving the Union. It was all about containing slavery, so they would not be enlarged. It had never, because if it had anything, guys, in all honesty, to do with the liberation of the so-called black man and black woman, the America the America we live in today would not exist. This hatred, this bigotry, this merciless killing, this mass incarceration, aborting our babies, putting Planned Parenthood clinics in our communities, and enticing our daughters to run into these places, and encouraging our sons to not take responsibility for their seed, their sons and daughters that are in these women who are going in those Planned Parenthood, by telling our women their men have no say whatsoever about their seed. Vicious, wicked behavior that hasn't changed over 100 now in 5 years plus, somewhere give or take, 45 plus another, about 165 years later. America is still wrenching and stinking of the filth of racism and chattel slavery. It still stinks that way. Every time you walk by a penitentiary or a prison or a local jail, and you see black men and black women there incarcerated for just petty crimes or for conditions that created the environment for them to end up there, a little light bulb should go off in your mind and say, damn, nothing has changed. How you say? A different day, but the same old damn thing. And again, and that's why I insist on continuing to speak against this viciousness, this wickedness, and all of those who are here in America today, the children of those violent, vicious devils, who still will not stand up and try to right the wrong of their ancestors.